this horrifying speech. It is with a heavy heart that we all need to admit the grim reality of a new aggressive and revanchist rule rising over Europe. This is the fourth time that the General Assembly debates the situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. However, this is the first time we debate the situation in the new reality created by the illegal recognition of two territories of Ukraine by Russia. And the backdrop of our discussion today is much more dangerous, as Russia attacked the very fundamental principles of international peace and security, the pillars of the United Nations, and, as I mentioned, the very existence of the Ukrainian state, a founding member of the United Nations. Ukraine, that signed the UN Charter in San Francisco in 1945 and made the principle enshrined in Article 2 of the Charter a cornerstone of its foreign policy. A state that voluntarily gave up its nuclear arsenal under the security assurances of nuclear powers. A state that has endured years of assault by one of these powers, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. 2 days ago, on February 21st, the Russian president recognized so-called independence of the temporarily occupied parts of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine and ordered the deployment of the Russian armed forces in these areas. This is an on-front attack on the United Nations and core principles of international law, an ultimate blow to years of peace process and Russia's unilateral withdrawal from the Minsk agreements. What is happening right now in eastern Ukraine, where Russian tanks are rolling in, and along the Ukrainian borders, where Russian forces are amassed in enormous quantities, must be a concern for everyone, for all of you. I warn every nation in this distinguished chamber: no one will be able to sit out this crisis if President Putin decides that he can move forward with his aggression against Ukraine. Your governments and your people will face painful consequences together with our government and our people. This is why we need to use this last chance for action and stop Russia where it is. It is clear that President Putin will not stop by himself. Distinguished representatives, the beginning of a large-scale war in Ukraine will be the end of the world order as we know it. If Russia does not get a severe, swift, and decisive response now, this will mean a total bankruptcy of the international security system and international institutions which are tasked with maintaining the global security order. This is a grim scenario, which will throw us back to the darkest times of the 20th century. Russia will not stop at Ukraine. If a permanent member of the UN Security Council succeeds in breaking literally all rules, other actors will be inspired by him and follow his pattern. What he tries to do now is to prove that the United Nations are weak, indecisive, and unable to defend their core principles, that rules do not apply to him, to Russia, to Putin. What role for the United Nations does Russia see? A new League of Nations. We must deny Russia what it wants. I graduated from the university with a degree in international law and strong belief in multilateralism. Many years after practicing diplomacy, I still do believe in both rules containing aggression and the power of our collective and firm action. If the United Nations make a pivot right now to become a strong and proactive player, which is not afraid of resolute actions and using all of its might and powers, I am confident that Russia will stop. In this context, I welcome yesterday's statement by the United Nations Secretary General, which is truly different in tone. We need decisive actions of the same kind to follow these right words. Russia shows signs of readiness to further escalate its aggression against Ukraine, and we have limited time to stop, deter, and contain it. Every hour of inaction now is a threat to the lives of Ukrainians. Not only military, but also civilians, including women and children. This is an escalating threat to our collective global security and to our freedom. Ukraine expects decisive, immediate, and proportional actions by the international community. The United Nations is the organization that has to demonstrate leadership, not just condemnations. Concrete actions to stop the Russian machine of war without stepping into a bloody conflict with many thousands of casualties, devastation, and suffering. I do not want this. Ukraine doesn't want this. The world doesn't want this. We need your help right now to stop Russia from proceeding with its aggressive plans. Ukraine believes in diplomacy. We see no alternative to peaceful solutions by political and diplomatic means. There is still an opportunity for diplomacy to say its word, even as Russia continues its escalation and provocations. For months, Russia pretended to pursue diplomacy while bringing more and more troops to our borders and in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Now this number stands at least at 150,000. Under the OSCE Vienna document on confidence and security building measures, such actions fall under the qualification of unusual military activities that would require explanation. However, Russia has persistently refused to provide it. Instead, it proceeded with threats. Russia has literally stuffed the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov with at least 46 military vessels. It routinely closes large parts of the seas under the pretext of holding naval exercises. In practice, it amounts almost to a blockade of Ukrainian seaports. This is already an attack on the global freedom of navigation, one of the sacred principles of international law. Russia's propaganda machine is in full swing. It desperately tries to create a pretext for further aggression against Ukraine. We resolutely reject all Russian insinuations about any alleged Ukrainian offensive military operations in Donbas. We do not hold or plan any such actions. We remain committed to political and diplomatic settlement, and together with our partners, we maximize efforts to reduce tensions and keep the situation in line with diplomatic dialogue. For now, we see that Russian occupation forces have already significantly increased shelling of Ukrainian territory and civilian infrastructure. Artillery fire at the contact line in the Donbas from the occupied territory hit a kindergarten in a town called Stanitsa Luhanska and a school in Vrubivka, among the latest terrible examples. Recognition of the so-called republics has no legal implications. It merely confirms Russia's own involvement as a party to the armed conflict in Donbas, which Russia vehemently denied all these years. The situation in the occupied Donbas has already been terrible for years, with residents living in the atmosphere of fear, lawlessness, and insecurity. The infamous secret prison called Izolyatsiya in the occupied Donetsk remains inaccessible for human rights and humanitarian missions. It continues to function as a literal concentration camp in Europe in the 21st century. Hundreds of people have passed through this camp, and were subjected to heavy forced labor, humiliation, tortures. Cases of extrajudicial killings have been reported too. Russia continues to block the release of the illegally detained persons. In September 2029, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, handed over to the Secretary General the list of more than 100 Ukrainians from Donbas and Crimea who had been unlawfully detained, sentenced, or even transferred from the occupied territories to the Russian Federation. We reiterate our call on the Secretary General to provide good offices and facilitate their immediate release. And I appreciate the readiness of the Secretary General to do so. Mr. President, today, Ukraine defends not only global security, but also freedom, democracy, and fundamental principles of international law. Peaceful life and the future of millions of people in Europe and around the globe rely on the rules that Russia tries to destroy. Diplomacy and international fora must prevail and stop the Russian aggression. Since 2014, the General Assembly has already adopted 11 resolutions reaffirming its commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity and condemning the temporary occupation of Ukraine's territories by Russia. The General Assembly has not and will not accept the Russian mantra that the case of Crimea is closed, end of quote. The occupying power persists in destroying the identity of Ukrainians and the indigenous people of the peninsula, the Crimean Tatars. Since 2014, more than 64,000 Ukrainian citizens have had to leave Crimea and moved to mainland Ukraine due to fear, persecution for political and human rights activism, discrimination on ethnic and religious grounds. Political persecutions continue unabated. Among many others, Mr. Nariman Jelalov, deputy head of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people, participant of the International Crimea Platform Summit, remains behind bars. He is one of more than 100 political prisoners of the Kremlin. On February 16, a court in Simferopol sentenced journalist Vladislav Yesipenko on trumped-up charges to 6 years in prison. He is one of 14 Ukrainian journalists kept by Russians in prison. Russia may continue to pretend it doesn't violate any international norms and principles. Yet, reports by the UN Security Secretary General, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OSCE, their missions, as well as the report of the International Criminal Court prosecutor, all testify to the contrary. If Russia doesn't agree with all the mentioned resolutions and reports, it should simply provide access to Crimea, to the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. The access of international organizations to the occupied territories is critical. Ukraine guarantees such access throughout the government-controlled territory and continues to demand from the Russian side to do the same in the occupied territories. Esteemed members of the General Assembly, the whole world witnesses today that Russia turns to threatening and blackmailing the global community to close the Crimea case. End of quote. It is, in fact, one of the points in the long list of its recent so-called security demands. Ukraine continues efforts to achieve the occupation of Crimea by peaceful means. The Crimea platform is a tool designed exactly for that end. We are truly thankful to all the countries supporting the International Crimea platform. Your active involvement in the platform is a sound foundation for our future success. We are open to new members, and I call on you to join the Crimea platform, be it states or international organizations. You are welcome. We expect the United Nations will find proper modalities to engage with this initiative established on the principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, dear colleagues, Ukraine made a historic contribution to global security. In 1994, we denuclearized, giving up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. We have no plans to regain nuclear weapons. Today, we expect the world reciprocally to ensure our security with relevant scale and resoluteness of actions in the face of a historic level of threat. This is the reason why Ukraine requested urgent consultations under Article 6 of the Budapest Memorandum. The world owes Ukraine its security. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky initiated a new format of negotiations to settle the security crisis created by Russia. 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus Ukraine, Germany, and Turkey. This is the format that we are trying to convene. I reaffirm that Ukraine proposed some years ago to deploy a UN peacekeeping mission to Ukraine. Until now, United Nations Security Council has failed to take necessary decisions. Ukraine proposes to combine stark sanctions policy and strengthening of Ukraine together with keeping diplomatic channels open to persuade Russia to de-escalate and prioritize diplomacy. We urge member states to use all available means to protect Ukraine and deter Russia. Whatever action you can take is appreciated. We are grateful for the actions already taken by many of you. We expect the international community to do its best to put out the fire in the center of Europe, which is about to flare up. The Russian security crisis must end with Russia returning to the path of diplomacy. We call on all states and international organizations not to recognize any alteration of the status of the certain areas of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine, and to refrain from any action of dealing that might be interpreted as recognizing any such altered status. The absence of proper reaction or a neutral stance will only contribute to further escalation and sufferings. And, I regret to say it, it will not be limited to Ukraine's border and territory. On the contrary, active diplomacy, strong political messaging, tough economic sanctions, and strengthening Ukraine can still force Moscow to abandon aggressive plans. Swift and resolute actions by the United Nations can reclaim the organization's leading role at this historic and dark moment. Russia must withdraw its forces from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Russia must stop destabilizing the international security situation. We Ukrainians want peace, and we want to resolve all issues through diplomacy. We stand ready for all possible scenarios and ready to protect our land and our people if Russia further attacks. Ukraine will not hesitate to exercise its inherent right of self-defense as outlined in Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations in response to the armed attacks of the Russian Federation. These days, we have probably the last window of opportunity to do what Russia does not expect the United Nations and its member states to do. Demonstrate unprecedented ability and readiness to act in order to stop aggression. No matter what relations you develop among each other, it is your ultimate duty to defend the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Lord Ahmed, Minister for South Asia and North Africa, the United Nations, and the Commonwealth at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Your Excellencies, the United Kingdom is unwavering in its support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. We stand with the people of Ukraine. We stand with their right to determine their own future. President Putin's decision to recognize the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic as independent states proves beyond doubt that Russia has chosen the path of confrontation over the path of diplomacy and dialogue. Mr. Putin has ordered his troops into Ukrainian territory. This amounts to a further invasion of Ukraine. Mr. President, at every step, Russia has rebuffed offers of diplomacy and indeed discarded its international commitments. Commitments it has itself agreed and signed up to. Rather, it has pursued a campaign to withdraw Ukraine's internationally recognized borders by force. It is vital that we, the United Nations, the international community, must respond. We must understand the grave nature of where we are today. And together we must call on Russia to uphold the very founding principles of this, the United Nations, established precisely, as you said yourself, Mr. President, to end the scourge of war. Peace must prevail. We must highlight the human cost and respond to the humanitarian consequences of any further Russian military action. We know this will take a terrible toll on Ukrainians, but also it will take a toll on Russians alike, both victims of an unnecessary war of the Kremlin's choosing. And it's therefore essential that we must meet Russia's aggressive acts with solidarity, with strength, including through coordinated sanctions, to impose a severe cost on Russian interests and their economy. Yesterday, the United Kingdom announced new sanctions, targeting billions of Russian assets. This is the largest sanctions package against Russia in British history, and it is part of our coordinated sanctions effort alongside our allies. But, Mr. President, we are clear that acting together with our allies, this is just the start. If Russia continues its campaign of aggression, we have a further package of sanctions ready to go. We urge the wider international community to join us in this effort. The Kremlin must understand the strength of the world's condemnation of President Putin's war of choice. Mr. President, let us pause for a moment. Let us reflect. This very week marks 8 years since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. It also marks 8 years since Russia's forcibly seized 10,000 square miles of sovereign Ukrainian territory, in flagrant violation of international law and Russia's own international commitments. And it's also 8 years since we, the General Assembly of the United Nations, recalled through Resolution 68262 the obligations of all states under Article 2 of the UN Charter to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state of the United Nations. Yet, 8 years on, Tragically, here we are again, confronted by Russian aggression against the sovereignty of Ukraine. And as Secretary General Antonio Guterres has made clear, Russia's unilateral measures conflict directly with the very principles of the United Nations Charter. Their actions are a fundamental challenge to global peace and security, and a challenge to the international order on which we all rely. And equally important, it is for all of us to protect. We must condemn unequivocally this aggression together and stop President Putin's expansionist ambitions. Mr. President, we must hold Russia true to its commitments under the UN Charter and say to Russia very clearly, pull back, choose peace, not war, whilst also sending a very clear message to the people of Ukraine that in your hour of need, we, the international community, we, the United Nations, stand with you. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for South Asia, North Africa, the United Nations, and the Commonwealth at the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to His Excellency Tobias Linde, Minister of State for the Federal Foreign Office of Germany.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we meet today in a time of challenge. A couple of days ago, the president of a member state of this organization put into question the statehood of another distinguished member of this organization. He said, and I quote, "Ukraine actually never had stable traditions of statehood," unquote. We must take this sentence very seriously. Some important questions arise. What does it mean for this organization if one state construes the existence of another state as a regrettable accident of history, thereby questioning its right to exist? What does it mean for a common objective of promoting peace and development if more countries try to roll back history in a similar way? What does it mean for the multilateral rules-based order if states think they can, due to their own view of history, domineer over other states and put them under tutelage? We still do not have answers to all of these questions. What is clear already now, Russia's decision to recognize the self-proclaimed so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk could be a deadly blow for the international rules-based order, for the way this organization has functioned over the last decades. Russia is violating the core principles of the UN Charter. We need to close ranks and strongly reject such action. If not, then what has hit Ukraine today could happen to other UN member states tomorrow. Everybody in this assembly should be aware of this. It is therefore with utmost gratitude that we took note of the Secretary General's words. He said, "The principles of the UN Charter are not a menu a la carte. They cannot be applied selectively. Member states have accepted them all, and they must apply them all." Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing to add to these crystal clear words. Russia's irresponsible and provocative action comes at a time of a massive military buildup alongside Ukraine's borders. We have seen a concerning flare-up of ceasefire violations along the line of contact. We have witnessed a disturbing flow of disinformation and false flag operations meant to create pretexts for military incursion. This time of increased tensions, where people's lives are at risk, would have been the time to go for de-escalation, to heed the Security Council's repeated calls for diplomatic efforts. Instead, Russia chose to again attack Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity 8 years after Russia had illegally seized and annexed Crimea. The General Assembly condemned this UN Charter violation, and it should do so again. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I commend Ukraine's continued restraint in the face of this aggression. President Zelensky's commitment to finding a peaceful diplomatic way out. Since 2014, France and Germany have done their utmost to work towards a political solution of the conflict in eastern Ukraine on the basis of the Minsk agreements. Russia's signature is under these agreements. Over the last weeks, Chancellor Scholz and my Foreign Minister Baerbock have left no stone unturned to engage with Russia diplomatically in close coordination with our French partners. We are willing to chart a way forward, strengthening trust, stability, and security in Europe. We have the framework established to do this in the NATO-Russia Council, in the OSCE, and in the Normandy format. The ceasefire in the Donbass must be observed immediately. We condemn the use of heavy weaponry and indiscriminate shelling of civilian infrastructure, which constitutes a clear violation of the Minsk agreements. This must stop. We commend the OSCE Special Representative for trying to convene an extraordinary session of the Trilateral Contact Group. France, Ukraine, and my country stand ready for another meeting in the Normandy format or for the summit that Ukraine has proposed. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission is vital for monitoring the situation in eastern Ukraine. This is why Germany's seconded staff remains on the ground. The SMM must be allowed to carry out its mandate in full. We want to resolve this crisis by diplomacy. To this end, Russia must immediately change its course of action. First, I urge Russia to de-escalate now, to withdraw its troops from Ukraine, in particular from the self-proclaimed entities and the Crimean Peninsula, as well as from Ukraine's borders. Second, Russia must refrain from any action which would further fuel the risk of a full-fledged military conflict with Ukraine. Third, I urge Russia to immediately repeal its decision to recognize the separatist entities. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, do we respect the territorial integrity and sovereign equality of UN member states? Do we stand by the UN Charter? I call on all member states to reaffirm our commitment to these principles over Ukraine and beyond. With our allies and partners, Germany will spare no effort to find a diplomatic way forward. We will be steadfast in our support for Ukraine, in our support for the UN Charter. It is a common duty to remain committed to a rules-based order, to trustful cooperation, to bringing forward a common goal of lasting peace and stability. We invite every member of this organization to join these efforts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, is the moment to speak up and defend the international order of the UN Charter against unilateral aggression jointly and decisively. I thank you.
I thank the Minister of State of the Federal Foreign Office of Germany. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your presence and for your briefing this morning, and for, with the legal, moral, and political authority of your office, clarifying the implications of what we are now seeing on the European continent and how it relates to the UN Charter. Mr. President, I will speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iceland and Norway, Georgia and Monaco align themselves with this statement. Mr. President, the European Union recalls its unwavering support to the sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We strongly condemn the decision by the President Putin to recognize the non-government-controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine as independent entities and the ensuing decision to send Russian troops into these areas. If there was any uncertainty, the Secretary General has made clear that the decision of the Russian Federation is a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of this United Nations. They undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and independence and are a severe breach of international law and international agreements, including the UN Charter, Helsinki Final Act, Paris Charter, and the Budapest Memorandum. With this decision, Russia is clearly violating the Minsk agreements. The European Union strongly condemns Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine, including through the unprecedented military buildup near the border with Ukraine and in the Black Sea, and through the deployment of combat forces in and the joint drills with Belarus, and calls on Russia to de-escalate, to abide by international law, and to engage constructively in dialogue through the established international mechanisms. The EU is responding to these latest violations with additional restrictive measures, including on all economic relations with the non-governmentally controlled areas, as well as designations against individuals and entities responsible for undermining the territorial integrity of Ukraine, in coordination with our partners. Russia's past and present actions against Ukraine are not a matter just for Ukraine or for Europe. They have severe global implications. Violations of fundamental principles of international law and the UN Charter directed towards another state is of serious global concern. These rules apply to all, and permanent members of the Security Council have particular responsibility in upholding the Charter. The EU fully subscribes to and for its part reaffirms our full commitment to the core principles of European security, enshrined in the UN Charter and the commitments Russia itself has subscribed to. This includes notably the sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states, the inviolability of frontiers, refraining from the threat or use of force, and the freedom of states to choose or change their own security arrangements. These principles are neither negotiable nor subject to revision or reinterpretation. Their violation by Russia is an obstacle to a common security space in Europe and threatens the peace and stability in Europe and worldwide. What is happening in Ukraine affects the security of each and every UN member state. We therefore call on Russia to respect the principles of the Charter, to de-escalate and to engage in the kind of meaningful diplomacy that we have offered and that the Secretary General has reiterated and supported. Mr. President, we call on Russia to constructively engage in the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group to achieve the full implementation of the Minsk agreements endorsed by the Security Council Resolution 2202. Russia needs urgently to de-escalate tensions caused by the military buildup along its border with Ukraine and on Crimea, and cease the provocation and aggressive rhetoric. Russia must change course and constructively contribute to negotiations in the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group in line with what was agreed in recent N4 meeting in Paris and Berlin. We welcome the OSCE Special Representative's attempts to convene extraordinary sessions of the Trilateral Contact Group to diffuse tensions, and we expect Russia to accept the invitation to such a meeting in the future. We also call on Russia to immediately stop fueling the conflict and remove Russian troops and hardware illegally deployed in areas currently not under the control of the government of Ukraine. The EU strongly condemns the recent increase of ceasefire violations, as well as orders for mobilization issued by the de facto authorities in areas currently not under control of the government of Ukraine. We condemn the use of heavy weaponry and recalls that the shelling of civilian infrastructures represents a clear violation of the ceasefire, the Minsk agreements, and international humanitarian law. The EU commends Ukraine's posture and restraint in the face of continued provocations and efforts at destabilization, as we've just heard from this rostrum this morning by the Foreign Minister. The EU underlines the role of the OSCE as the appropriate forum to address security concerns of all interested parties, including Russia. EU member states are ready to engage in strengthening the existing mechanisms to ensure military transparency and predictability, and to support efforts regarding arms control, in particular within the OSCE framework. In this regard, we urge Russia to abide by its commitments under the Vienna document and notably to provide full transparency on its military activities in the region, to host visits to the areas which are the cause of concern, to take significant and verifiable steps to de-escalate the situation and to provide information on the reported redeployment of Russian units from the locations of military exercises. We also express our support for the valuable engagement of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, the SMM, and its impartial monitoring. We're therefore deeply concerned by Russia's continued actions to obstruct the presence of the SMM in the non-government controlled areas of Ukraine. The SMM is mandated to monitor the entire territory of Ukraine within its international recognized borders, including in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. We urge Russia to respect the mandate of the SMM as agreed by all participating states and ensure that all restrictions affecting the mission's work are lifted immediately. We once again deplore the targeting of assets of the mission. The volatile security situation in eastern Ukraine has an immense impact on the civilian population, in particular persons in the most vulnerable situations living in the non-government controlled areas and along both sides of the contact line, where people are under continuous threat of shelling, and we share a profound concern for their sufferings. As a result of the conflict, 2.9 million Ukrainians are still in need of humanitarian assistance. We call on the sides to respect international humanitarian law and guarantee unhindered and sustained access for humanitarian actors, including UNHCR and other UN agencies, as well as national and international NGOs, to all people in need. The EU, together with its 27 member states, is the biggest donor of humanitarian aid to Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict. The EU will continue to support humanitarian organizations. Mr. President, let me turn to the situation in Crimea. These days, we commemorate 8 years since the beginning of the hostile Russian political and military actions against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, leading to the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation. This illegal annexation and Russia's subsequent actions on the peninsula and in surrounding waters are in blatant breach of international law and of key principles of the rules-based international order. They remain a direct challenge to international security with grave implications for the international law that protects the sovereignty, territorial integrity and unity of all states. In line with the resolutions of this General Assembly, the EU reconfirms its condemnation of this violation of international law and continues to implement its consistent non-recognition policy of the illegal annexation, including through restrictive measures together with transatlantic partners. As stated in Resolution 68262, the so-called referendum organized by Russia on the Crimean Peninsula in March 2014 has no legal validity. And we recall the obligation of all states not to recognize as lawful any territorial acquisition of special advantage resulting from aggression. And we call on all UN member states to remain steadfast in their policy of non-recognition of Russia's illegal annexation. We welcome Ukraine's efforts to continue to seek justice using international legal instruments and courts. The ongoing Russian militarization of the Crimean Peninsula has a negative impact on the security situation in the Black Sea region and beyond, and we call on Russia to refrain from impeding the lawful exercise of navigational rights and freedoms to and from the Sea of Azov in accordance with international law. We affirm the universal and unified character of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We remain seriously concerned about transfers by the Russian Federation of sophisticated weapon systems and military personnel to the peninsula since March 2014. As documented in the reports by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Russian citizenship and conscription in the armed forces of the Russian Federation have been imposed on Crimean residents in violation of international humanitarian law. Russian legislative elections have been illegally held in the legally annexed Crimea, and a population census conducted in an attempt to legitimize the illegal annexation of the peninsula. All these developments are extremely worrying and hostile. The EU remains deeply concerned about the severe deterioration of human rights situation in the Crimean Peninsula since its illegal annexation by the Russian Federation. Residents of the peninsula face systematic violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms, such as the rights to freedom of expression, religion or belief and association, and the right to peaceful assembly. Arbitrary detentions and convictions remain systemic. In particular, the human rights situation of the Crimean Tatars have been targeted. In accordance with the UN General Assembly Resolution 76179, adopted last December, it is crucial that regional and international human rights monitoring mechanisms, as well as non-governmental human rights organizations, are granted proper and unimpeded access to the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. Journalists, media workers, human rights defenders, and defense lawyers should be able to work independently and without undue interference and intimidation. Mr. President, the EU reaffirms our commitment to further support Ukraine's resilience, including encountering cyber and hybrid threats and tackling disinformation. The EU underlines the importance of Ukraine's reform agenda based on democracy, rule of law, respect for international law, and human rights. In conclusion, Mr. President, let me reiterate once again our firm belief that tensions and disagreements must be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy, and that this issue is not only a matter of regional concern, but of a global. Threats and violations of international law, including the UN Charter, affect all member states of the UN and all people of the world. I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lithuania on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Lithuania. All our countries have aligned with the statement of the European Union. Mr. President, despite the repeated calls for serious de-escalation by the UN Secretary General and recent intensive diplomatic efforts at all levels, Russia keeps dramatically escalating its aggressive actions against Ukraine. We strongly condemn the decision by President Putin to recognize the non-government controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine as independent entities and the ensuing decision to send Russian troops into these areas under the pretext of so-called peacekeeping. We call on Russia to reverse these decisions. As clearly stated by UN Secretary General and political leaders of our countries, these illegal acts further undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and independence and constitute a severe breach of international law and international agreements, including the UN Charter, Helsinki Final Act, Paris Charter, and Budapest Memorandum. We underline that Russian forces in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine would be nothing else than an invasion of a sovereign state. Calling them peacekeepers, to quote the Secretary General, is the perversion of the concept of peacekeeping. By these illegal acts, Russia is breaking its commitment to work with the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group in finding a peaceful settlement to the conflict. It is also violating UN Security Council Resolution 2202, which requires full implementation of the Minsk agreements. The Russian Federation's use of force against Ukraine is completely unjustified and unacceptable and must be met with unity, firmness, and determination, including through additional sanctions in solidarity with Ukraine. Russia's continued aggressive actions and threats against Ukraine and its recent unprecedented and large-scale military buildup in Ukraine and near its borders, including through deployment of combat forces in and the joint drills with Belarus, pose a threat not only to European, but also to the global security. In addition, Russia's increased military presence in the Black Sea and in the illegally annexed Crimean Peninsula, as well as the closure of the large parts of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, add to the threat of escalation also in the maritime sphere. Non-adherence to international law and its fundamental principles undermines the rules-based international order
and effective multilateralism. We underscore the crucial importance of upholding these principles, including to the right of all states to the sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and political independence, as well as freedom of states to choose their own security arrangements. The Nordic and Baltic countries stand in full solidarity with Ukraine, supporting its territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence within its internationally recognized borders. Russia has a clear and direct responsibility under international law to work to find a peaceful settlement of the conflict. We call on Russia to respect the principles of the UN Charter, to de-escalate, and to choose to engage in the meaningful diplomacy. Mr. President, in 3 days, we will mark the 8th anniversary of the illegal annexation of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by the Russian Federation. The Nordic and Baltic countries continue to condemn this blatant violation of international law and remain committed to implementing the EU's non-recognition policy, including through restrictive measures. We call on UN member states to consider similar measures in accordance with the UN General Assembly, the Resolution 68/262. We continue to condemn the increasing militarization of the Crimean Peninsula and the severe deterioration of the human rights situation there. We recall the obligation of all states not to recognize as lawful any territorial acquisition or special advantage resulting from the use of armed forces. The Russia-instigated conflict has resulted in around 14,000 deaths, 1.5 million displaced, countless damages and suffering of those living on both sides of the contact line. Furthermore, we are witnessing Russia's continued effort of de facto integration and systematic demographic changes of the illegally annexed Crimea, as well as non-government controlled areas in Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, including through accelerated issuing of Russian passports on the massive scale to Ukrainian citizens and forced conscription to the Russian armed forces. Such moves are making the conflict resolution efforts even more difficult. We are concerned about reported arbitrary detentions and arrests, especially of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian-speaking minorities, increasing pressure on journalists and media workers, human rights defenders, and other members of civil society. Russia must fully respect international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We call for the immediate release of all illegally detained and imprisoned persons in the Crimean Peninsula and in Russia. It is essential that international organizations and human rights actors have unhindered access to the areas currently not under control of the Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, in accordance with UN General Assembly Resolution 76/179 of the 16th December 2021. We urge Russia to withdraw its forces and materiel from within Ukraine, including the Crimean Peninsula and non-government controlled areas of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, as well as from areas adjacent to its borders, and to immediately stop fueling the conflict. We reiterate our full support to the efforts towards peaceful and sustainable resolution of this conflict through the established international mechanisms. We commend Ukraine for its constructive approach and urge Russia to assume its responsibility as a party to the conflict, upholding its commitments, abide by the international law, and return to the discussions within the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group. It is essential that the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission have free and unhindered access through Ukraine, including the Crimean Peninsula and non-government controlled areas in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine, in accordance with its mandates. We're deeply concerned regarding the continued restrictions of the mission's freedom of movement, including security incidents involving its staff and assets. Mr. President, the position of Nordic and Baltic countries is clear. It is our duty as members of the UN to defend the rules-based international order. Challenges to this order clearly affect international community as a whole. We urge Russia to abide by international law and uphold its international commitments. Like the Secretary General, we recall the obligations under the UN Charter of all members to refrain from the threat or use of force and to settle the international disputes by peaceful means. We thank the Secretary General for his clear message on Russia's aggressive actions and call for the UN to continue efforts to restore respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and unity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lithuania, who spoke on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, господин генеральный секретарь, начать свое выступление хотел бы с уточнения. Пункт повестки дня, по которому мы сегодня встречаемся, явно назван некорректно. И если он и должен отражать реальность, то речь нужно вести не о временно оккупированных территориях, а о территориях, потерянных в результате человека ненавистнической политики по отношению к собственным гражданам, которую Киев сделал национальной идеей после нелегитимного майданного переворота в 2014 году. По отношению особенно к тем гражданам, кто высказал несогласие с этим переворотом. С момента прихода к власти нынешний режим при молчаливом покровительстве западных кураторов занялся системным ущемлением базовых прав человека, в том числе по национальному признаку. Понимаем, что в центре сегодняшней дискуссии окажется признание Российской Федерации Донецкой и Луганской народных республик как актуальный новостной сюжет. Вокруг этого решения сейчас много спекуляций и инсинуаций. Хочу подчеркнуть, что произошедшее стало прямым следствием многолетнего саботажа Киевом своих прямых обязательств по комплексу мер, одобренному резолюцией Совета Безопасности 2202. С момента ее принятия в феврале 2015 года Россия была последовательно привержена этому непростому внутриукраинскому компромиссу. Мы делали все для сохранения суверенитета и территориальной целостности Украины, организовали множество заседаний Совета Безопасности ООН, встреч по формуле Ария, заинтересованно участвовали в работе нормандского формата и контактной группы в Минске, обсуждали ситуацию на востоке Украины в Организации по безопасности и сотрудничеству в Европе. И это при том, что стороной Минского процесса Россия не являлась и не является. Но все было тщетно. 8 лет Киев продолжал и продолжает бомбить своих же граждан и уклоняться от прямого диалога с Донбассом, а все мировое сообщество все эти 8 лет Киев водил за нос, уверяя в приверженности Минским соглашениям и готовности их выполнять, только в своей интерпретации. И, по сути, саботировал работу контактной группы в Минске, ведь большинство из вас даже не представляет себе, как проходили заседания контактной группы, и как украинские представители саботировали принятие решений не только по политическим, но и по экономическим и по гуманитарным вопросам. Однако в последнее время украинские руководители перестали стесняться и прямо на камеры заявили о том, что не собираются выполнять свои обязательства. Наверное, последним подтверждением этому стал тот факт, что украинский поспред недвусмысленно подтвердил такой настрой в ходе организованной нами встречи Совета Безопасности 17 февраля. А наши западные коллеги Украину к выполнению Минска даже не призывали. Стало очевидно, что никаких перспектив выполнения этого документа Киевом больше нет. Именно из-за нежелания Киева учитывать интересы широких слоев населения, Украина с 2014 года находится в состоянии войны со своими гражданами, не согласными с ценностями Майдана и нынешней политикой украинских властей. А западные покровители Украины ничего не сделали, чтобы убедить Киев услышать собственный народ, проявляя при этом вопиющие двойные стандарты. В любой другой кризисной ситуации государства-члены ООН призывают к инклюзивному, прямому диалогу конфликтующих сторон. В противном случае внутренний конфликт не подлежит урегулированию. Однако в случае на Украине все было с точностью да наоборот. Краеугольный камень комплекса мер, прямой диалог между Киевом и Донбассом, саботировался Киевом все это время. К нашему сожалению, генеральный секретарь ООН сделал на днях и сегодня несколько высказываний по поводу происходящего на востоке Украины, которые не соответствуют его статусу и его полномочиям по уставу ООН. Мы специально посмотрели статистику, прошлые файлы, досье и обнаружили, что не было ни одного конфликта, когда генеральный секретарь, будь то нынешний или его предшественники, позволял себе подобные высказывания в отношении любой страны. По ситуации на Украине генеральный секретарь ни разу не возвысил свой голос в пользу необходимости выполнения тех требований Минского комплекса мер, резолюции 2202 Совета Безопасности, которые прямо требуют решать все проблемы по согласованию между Киевом, Донецком и Луганском. Об этом никто и на Западе ни разу не упомянул. И, к сожалению, генеральный секретарь последовал этому печальному примеру. В этих условиях нам непонятно, какие добрые услуги, о которых говорил генеральный секретарь, он может предоставить. Крымчане, дончане и луганчане еще в 2014 году объявили о независимости. Крыму повезло больше. Его жители почти сразу же высказались в пользу присоединения к России и оказались под защитой Российской Федерации. Дончанам и луганчанам, которые наши немецкие и французские партнеры пообещали справедливое урегулирование, пришлось ждать нашего признания долгих 8 лет, в течение которых все еще теплилась надежда на то, что Киев одумается и начнет диалог со своими гражданами. Однако майданная власть подобных планов не имела и за эти годы осуществила две чудовищные и кровавые военные авантюры, закончившиеся разгромом украинской армии ополченцами и подписанием Минских соглашений. Вместо их выполнения Киев с самого начала вынашивал план реванша, не прекращая обстрелов мирных кварталов и диверсий. Кроме того, важно учитывать, что за эти годы Украина прочно превратилась в антироссию и возвела борьбу с русским языком и всем русским в ранг государственной политики. В стране появилась языковая инквизиция. Сфера употребления русского языка неуклонно сжималась, подвергалась репрессиям. Уже при президенте Зеленском, который в ходе предвыборной кампании рядился в одежды миротворца и защитника интересов всех украинцев, было запрещено вещание 6 оппозиционных каналов. Активно насаждалась и насаждается ложь о Второй мировой войне. Соратники Гитлера становились героями, а настоящие герои предавались забвению. Несогласные с такой политикой Киева преследовались, подвергались репрессиям, судебным преследованиям и физическим расправам, включая убийство оппозиционных политиков и журналистов. Таким образом, дончанам и луганчанам было очевидно, в какую Украину им предлагают вернуться. Однако даже перед лицом этого они не уходили от выполнения Минских соглашений, веря в то, что документ будет выполнен, и у них появится особый статус. Как оказалось, этим надеждам не суждено было сбыться. Сегодня всем известна чудовищная цифра в 14 тысяч жертв этого конфликта, среди которых сотни детей. Подавляющее большинство из них – это жители Донецка и Луганска. Все эти годы против Донбасса действует экономическая, транспортная и продовольственная блокада. Пожилые люди и дети прячутся от обстрелов по подвалам. Счет беженцев, которые спасаются в России, обратите внимание, в России, а не на Украине, только в последние дни идет на десятки тысяч, а конкретно сегодня их 96 тысяч человек. Для любого цивилизованного государства очевидно, что так со своим народом не поступают. А значит, Киеву нужны не донбассы, а только их земля. Об этом прямо говорил президент Зеленский, предложив донбассцам убираться в Россию. И при этом киевская власть именует этих людей, презрительно именует этих людей террористами. Убедившись в безнадежности ситуации, мы приняли решение о том, что народ Донбасса имеет право считать себя независимым. Остальное вам известно. Уважаемые коллеги, в условиях неприкрытого геноцида и попрания главного права человека, права на жизнь, наша страна не могла более оставаться безучастной к судьбе 4-миллионного Донбасса. Мы руководствовались прежде всего тем, что высшая ценность – это человеческая жизнь. Критикуя нас за это решение, вы проявляете полное безразличие к судьбе дончан и луганчан, как это делали Киев и его западные кураторы все 8 лет конфликта. И этот конфликт далеко не исчерпан. Обстрелы мирных кварталов обеих республик не прекратились. Запад продолжает наускивать, подбадривать и вооружать Киев. Предупреждаем, что в условиях, когда по просьбе Донецка и Луганска следить за режимом прекращения огня будут вооруженные силы России, либеральничать с нарушителями никто не станет. Поэтому призываю вас сегодня сосредоточить усилия на том, чтобы утихомирить Киев и удержать его от новых военных авантюр, которые могут дорого обойтись для нынешней украинской власти. Благодарю вас.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Mr. President, the government of Japan has a strong view that what is happening in and around Ukraine is not an isolated problem in Europe, but a problem for the entire international community and a challenge to the international order. It goes totally against the purposes and the principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, Japan consistently supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Russia's decision to recognize the independence of certain regions of eastern Ukraine seriously undermines those very principles in violation of international law. It is absolutely unacceptable, and Japan strongly condemns the series of recent Russian acts. Prime Minister Kishida, acting in lockstep with the international community, has announced sanction measures, including the suspension of the issuance of entry visas and asset freeze to individuals concerned. Japan continues to pay close attention with serious concern to the development of the situation, including Russia's military buildup in the armed areas around Ukraine's borders, and its decision regarding the deployment of its forces outside its territory. Tensions should be de-escalated by the withdrawal of Russian troops, and this is essential to restore the cause of diplomacy. Any threat or use of force against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states goes against the fundamental principles that underpin the rules-based international order. It is a clear violation of international law, and what is at stake for the member states is the rule of law and the UN Charter itself. Mr. President, Japan expresses its solidarity with the people of Ukraine for the hope come true. Japan has made its own diplomatic efforts for a peaceful solution and supports the efforts of all countries for a serious diplomatic solution to the present crisis. Before closing, let me reiterate that unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion are unacceptable, regardless of wherever they take place. No member state can afford to be a bystander. Japan will continue to work hand in hand with other partners. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Member states of the United Nations, we stand at a crossroads in the history of this body. On Monday, President Putin announced that Russia would recognize as independent states the so-called DNR and LNR regions, part of the sovereign territory of Ukraine, controlled by Russia's proxies since 2014. He then ordered Russian military forces, under the guise of so-called peacekeepers, to deploy to these regions. In the hours that followed, Secretary General Guterres said this was a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. He reaffirmed that to us in his remarks today. In an emergency meeting Monday night, all but one member of the Security Council called for dialogue and diplomacy, which can only happen if Russia abandons its unprovoked further aggression toward Ukraine. Has Russia heeded these calls? No. Instead, it has responded with additional actions to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty, including mass disinformation, which we just heard again today, cyber attacks, and efforts to create a false flag pretext, in addition to Russia's overwhelming military buildup of more than 150,000 troops near Ukraine's border. Russia's actions have only confirmed what we and other nations have been warning about. Other UN member states must recognize the threat before us all today, before it's too late. Colleagues, there's no middle ground here. Calling for both sides to de-escalate only gives Russia a pass. Russia is the aggressor here. History tells us that looking the other way is ultimately the more costly path. And we need only to look across the past decade for an indication of the path that Russia is taking. Since 2014, Russia has occupied Crimea following its illegal invasion and has been manufacturing and fueling ongoing military conflicts in eastern Ukraine. In recent years, including President Putin's remarks this week, Russian leaders have claimed that Ukraine is not a real country. They have questioned its right to exist. Russia's actions are an unprovoked violation of international law, of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and a direct contradiction of the Minsk agreements. Russia's aggression not only threatens all of Ukraine, but every member state and the UN itself. Colleagues, President Putin gave us the clearest indication of his intentions on Monday when he asked the world to travel back in time by more than 100 years before the United Nations even existed to an age of empires. He asserted that Russia can recolonize its neighbors and that he will use force to make a farce of the United Nations. The United States rejects that firmly. This is 2022. We're not going back to an era of empires and colonies or to the USSR or the Soviet Union. We have moved forward, and we must ensure, as the permanent representative from Kenya said in the Security Council on Monday night, that the embers of dead empires do not ignite new forms of oppression and violence. Unfortunately, the fake reality Russia wants to create is already having real consequences for the people of Ukraine and for the world. To date, Russia's war in eastern Ukraine has already killed more than 14,000 people, nearly 3 million Ukrainians, half of whom are elderly people and children, need food, shelter, and other life-saving assistance. And of course, ordinary Russians should be asking how many Russian lives Putin is willing to sacrifice to feed his ambitions. If Russia continues down this path, it could, according to our estimates, create a new refugee crisis, one of the largest facing the world today, with as many as 5 million more people displaced by Russia's war of choice and putting pressure on Ukraine's neighbors. And because Ukraine is one of the world's largest wheat suppliers, especially for the developing world, Russia's actions could cause a spike in food prices and lead to even more desperate hunger in places like Libya, Yemen, and Lebanon. The tidal wave of suffering this war will cause are unthinkable. And then there's the broader threat that Russia's actions upend our international system, make a mockery of the UN Charter, and call into question our most fundamental principles of sovereignty, diplomacy, and territorial integrity. Unfortunately, despite these terrible, world-altering outcomes, Russia appears determined to proceed. Together with our partners and allies, President Biden has taken decisive action to make the cost of Russia's actions crystal clear. But as much as we all want Russia to de-escalate and choose the path of peace, that is not our choice to make. This is President Putin's war of choice. If he chooses to escalate further, Russia and Russia alone will bear full responsibility for what is to come. What we can do together today is make clear that Russia will pay an even steeper price if it continues this.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, it has been 8 years since the occupation of Crimea. Since the first day, the international community has maintained a resolute position. We never recognized the illegal annexation. And we have always supported Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and its political unity within its internationally recognized borders. This is our legal and moral obligation. Mr. President, today we face a new act of aggression, this time against another part of Ukrainian territory. This is totally unacceptable. We reject Russia's decision to recognize the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk republics and send in additional troops. It is illegal and illegitimate. It is in contravention of the Minsk agreements and constitutes a flagrant violation of Ukraine's political unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Mr. President, we do not need, nor do we want, a new war in our region. We call upon Russia to reverse its decision and return to diplomacy and dialogue on the basis of the Minsk agreements. This is the only way that will take us away from the precipice. Therefore, we call for restraint and common sense. We urge the parties to get together around the negotiation table without delay. As a neighbor to both parties, we are ready to facilitate this process and host technical and/or high-level meetings. We also welcome President Zelensky's proposal for a meeting between P5, Turkey, Germany, and Ukraine. Finally, we continue to support the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission led by Ambassador Halit Çevik. Mr. President, I am obliged to repeat, today Ukraine, a founding member of the United Nations, is faced with yet another act of aggression, and the global community is faced with yet another threat to regional and international peace and security. But above all, this is an aggression against the fundamental principles of international law and the UN Charter. Make no mistake, we all need the rules-based international order. It is our duty as member states to defend legality. It is our obligation to ensure that conflicts are resolved through peaceful means. We must make sure that the founding principles of the UN are upheld. This is the only way to save ourselves from the scourge of war. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. And I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Señor Presidente, señor Secretario General, una vez más, otra grave crisis con peligrosas repercusiones mundiales vuelve a tocar las puertas de Europa del Este y de nuestra organización. Al reconocer las regiones del Donetsk y del Luhansk como entidades independientes, la Federación de Rusia viola la soberanía y la integridad territorial de Ucrania. Transgrede la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, los acuerdos de Minsk y el Memorándum de Budapest, así como reiteradas resoluciones del Consejo de Seguridad y de este.
Important congressional delegation. We went to Israel. We began our trip in Israel, where we met at the highest level with the Prime Minister, the President, who welcomed us in the grandest style to review the troops and be honored at events. But the really important part were our conversations about our unanimous view within our CODEL of support for the two-state solution. When we met with the Palestinian government under the leadership of the People's Palestinian Authority and the leadership of President Abbas, we delivered the same message, a message of peace and two-state solution. Went on to Munich. Of course, when we planned this trip, it was not a trip that was planned in the backdrop of the imminent invasion of Ukraine. But that became obviously the centerpiece of the Munich Security Conference. Many of us have gone to that conference over the years to talk about security, economy, and how that relates to security, and governance, and how that relates to security. In fact, those three things, security, economy, and governance, are the purpose of any foreign travel of members of Congress. The Munich conference, it gives us a distilled way to see so many leaders from so many countries on those subjects. And at this time, of course, the focus was Ukraine. We had more than one delegation, but around 40 members of Congress, House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, all united in our support for the transatlantic alliance, NATO, all of us united in being there to remove all doubt in Putin or anyone else's mind that we were acting as one. And of course, that would have been our message with or without Ukraine. Ukraine made it even more so, because now we're talking about sanctions and the rest. We are very proud of our vice president our president whose leadership has been outstanding, and the message was delivered to the conference by the vice president. It was well received, it was unifying, it was firm in terms of how we would work together for sanctions should there be an invasion of Ukraine. What I just want to say as a sideline to my colleagues is that I was so pleased with how many women who were there were leaders in national security. When you're at this, the dynamic is people come up to you, well, you have all kinds of bilateral meetings planned. We met with the new chancellor of Germany, we met with the head of the EU, the head of the NATO, the mayor of Kyiv. We met with very high-level bilateral meetings. But as you're there, others approach. And for example, the president of Moldova is a woman, and she expressed concern to me that the Russian propaganda was having an impact there, where they were making a case that they had to go into Ukraine because Ukraine had done this, that, or the other thing. The president of Kosovo, a woman, told me that the Russians were successful in having some Serbians on the border put forth a Russian message. Both the foreign minister and the defense minister of Canada are women. We shared some thoughts about what's going on in Canada right now. The foreign minister of Germany is spectacular, a woman, and she was here recently, and so we renewed that friendship there, as well as meeting before we left with the foreign secretary of the UK. I would just say that because there's a lot of informal contact that reinforces, first of all, the need. I think that one thing that we all agreed upon, the attack on the Ukraine by the Russians is an attack on democracy, an attack on democracy. And our final visit was to the UK. We met with Boris Johnson, but our real host was the Speaker of the House of Commons, with a great welcome to the House of Commons, which is unusual, they tell me, and then a formal luncheon where we could interact with members of Parliament of all levels and all parties. Well, they don't have that many parties, but the fact is they were very united. Every place we were, that people were united in opposition to what was happening, of course, in Ukraine, but more importantly, in what we needed to do about that. You know, we're traditionally about the issues of security, economy, and governance. In recent years, of course, the climate issue is an issue in all of those categories, and so is COVID. So that were part of our conversation. We did meet with the head of the World Health Organization and got an up-to-date on how he saw things globally. And again, in every place we went, that the COVID challenge was part of our discussion. So it was intensely busy, and we were magnificently served. You've seen the list of members. They are mostly from our security committees: Adam Schiff, Intelligence; Adam Smith, Armed Services; Ted Deutsch, Foreign Affairs; Barbara Lee, Appropriate. Well, let me come back to Barbara and Betty McCollum. Jim Himes, Intelligence; Bill Keating, Foreign Affairs and Armed Services; Sean Patrick Maloney, Intelligence; Eric Swalwell, Intelligence and Homeland Security; Ruben Gallego, Armed Services; Seth Moulton, Armed Services; Ro Khanna, Armed Services; Andy Kim, Armed Services and Foreign Policy. But when you're having these discussions, all roads lead to the Appropriations Committee. And Betty McCollum, the chair of the Defense Subcommittee, was really a very important participant in the conversations about our support for the defense of Ukraine. And Barbara Lee, in terms of her committee, the Foreign Ops, State Foreign Ops Committee, in terms of, well, she'll talk about it, but she was in great demand because whether it was about refugees or whether it was about humanitarian assistance or whether it was about the loan guarantees, and the list goes on. So again, we were well served by the leadership, knowledge, and commitment of our participants. And all of them were not in every country, but mostly they were. It's stunning to see, in this day and age, a tyrant roll into a country. This is the same tyrant who attacked our democracy in 2016. This is the same tyrant who is opposed to democracy and wants to trivialize it, to downgrade it in the eyes of the Russian people. One other person I met there who was so courageous was Svetlana. We just call her Svetlana. You know, she was the wife of the person who ran for president in Belarus. She has escaped. Her husband is imprisoned. But she had a movement in Belarus, largely women, but not just women. And the people turned out by the hundreds of thousands. And then the president of Belarus declared himself the winner of the election. But the desire for democracy is alive and well in the Ukraine. Many of us who have visited there can attest to that. So the people of Ukraine, although it's not a Article 5 country, we will not have boots on the ground, know that we are with them, not only in spirit, but materially in terms of meeting their needs and just heralding their message with gratitude for the defense that the people of Ukraine are making for democracy. As I mentioned, underlying all of this were our meetings with heads of station in all of the countries that we were in about the intelligence of what was going on, what they knew about a range of subjects that are central to our national security. We were very pleased to have on the trip the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff. Adam, you want to share some of your views of what you saw there? Excuse me. And thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today, Russia has again invaded Ukraine. As the Speaker said, it is a stunning fact that in this century we once again see a despotic regime trying to remake the map of Europe by dint of military force. Because of the courageous actions of Ukrainians, the courageous forbearance of Ukraine not to rise to Russian provocation, and because of, I think, the very shrewd declassification of intelligence by our president, by our allies, it stripped away any Russian pretext and laid bare for the world to see that this Russian invasion of Ukraine is nothing more than naked aggression by Vladimir Putin. Putin is terrified by the prospect of a democracy at his border, a democracy giving an example to the Russian people of the kind of life and economy they might enjoy if they cast aside their own autocrat. This is, I think, one of the preeminent motivations of Vladimir Putin. Set aside the nonsense he puts out about Ukraine not being a real country. That is nothing but a Kremlin lie. This is about Vladimir Putin's desire for his own personal and national aggrandizement at the expense of his neighbor, and it's about his fear of a successful democracy providing an example to his own countrymen. I was very encouraged by what we saw in Munich. I was there with the speaker 2 years ago, and the theme of the conference 2 years ago was whether the West was a coherent whole, whether the West was essentially relevant as a coherent body of nations. And there was no question about that this year. Putin brought NATO together in a way I don't think we have seen in quite some time. And it was heartening to see that as a result of our administration's diplomatic efforts, countries had come together to agree on a brutal package of sanctions, some of which have already been applied, more which will, I fear, be necessary to apply. Among the most significant of steps was the step announced also by the German Chancellor. We were all very impressed by our conversation with him. The decision to essentially cancel the process of moving forward with the pipeline, I think is a very strong indication of the solidarity of NATO and our other allies to punish Putin for this naked aggression and the prospect of further devastating sanctions in the days and weeks ahead. So very encouraged by the solidarity of NATO, and we're going to have to remain united because Putin will look to exploit any fissure, any crack within NATO and our coalition, and we simply cannot have nations using military force in violation of the international rules-based order to enlarge their own borders, to subvert the democratic institutions of their neighbors or others around the world. As the speaker pointed out, they tried with the United States in 2016 and continue to do so. And thank you, Madam Speaker, for leading a remarkable CODEL.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Speaker Pelosi, for, and I just have to say this, for being such a global leader. And we were able and privileged to witness you on the global stage. So it was quite amazing, and thank you for putting together such a diverse grouping of members from a variety of committees for this congressional delegation. Our congressional delegation, of course, we went to Munich Security Summit to make clear that we remain fully committed to maintaining the unity with our European allies, as we now witness as it relates to how democracies around the world are under attack, specifically with Ukraine now. The Congress continues to address the domestic threats to our democracy, such as, but not limited to, campaigns of mis- and disinformation, and we remain unified in addressing threats to democracies around the world. And we see this unity in our efforts to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine through robust diplomatic initiatives, but we all know that authoritarian regimes around the world will stop at nothing to dismantle democratic values, and nobody is exempt, no country is exempt, including the United States. I was struck by what was written on the back of the chairs during the general session. The wording was peace through dialogue. All of our European allies embraced that notion throughout the entire conference. In each of our meetings, the threat was discussed, as well as the need to invest in and prioritize the role of diplomacy in seeking security and peace. Vice President Harris and Secretary Blinken both underscored the fact that they have engaged in robust diplomatic initiatives and that democracy remains the essential defense against accelerating forces of autocracy and illiberalism around the world. And that's why defending democracy, both at home and abroad, must be an urgent national security priority. Madam Speaker mentioned the fact that I do chair the House Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, which oversees many of the resources to assist the Ukrainian people through this crisis. This includes economic assistance to Ukraine, including loan guarantees. Economic assistance would come through the economic support accounts or for Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia. Those are the accounts they would come through. Without getting in too many of the weeds, I wanted to just mention that because it's an effort that we're looking at now in terms of our funding. Also, it includes humanitarian funds, including funding for refugees, God forbid, and for those internally displaced by conflict. The administration has committed to us that in the event of conflict, there is a need over the next 12 months of at least $1 billion for humanitarian needs. And so I support
the decision based on the UN General Assembly resolution. So I'm certain that if there is a will, there is a way. And we will be working with the United Nations on making sure that the will is there and we find the way to put pressure on Russia.
Minister, you got to talks with Americans yesterday. You met Secretary Blinken, you met President Biden. You never comment on that until now. Could you tell what is the main message you got from Americans?
The United both, not even both, but my three main counterparts, my three main interlocutors in Washington, President Biden, State Secretary Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin, they all conveyed three very clear messages. First, the United States will stand by Ukraine, whatever happens, whatever scenario Russia will prefer. Second, the United States will continue to provide Ukraine with defensive weapons to further build our capacity to defend our country. And I would like to assure you that we would be happy if we never have to pick up those weapons and use them in the battlefield. We want peace. But if Russia attacks, we have to be equipped to fight back. And the third message was that US sanctions will be continued. There will be more sanctions on Russia, more painful sanctions on Russia, and they will be done in close coordination with the allies, with the US allies in Europe and other parts of the world in order to ensure the maximum efficiency of these sanctions. So these are the political messages, but I assure you that in our talks we were very specific about the ways how these messages will be turned into actions in the coming days. And we appreciate, for example, the sanctions which were already imposed by the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, the European Union, some other countries, but this is not enough. And our partners should not wait for Russian rockets to hit Ukrainian soil or Russian planes to cross into our airspace to impose the new wave of sanctions. Sanctions make sense when they deter Russia from further action. So the time for the next wave of sanctions has come. We are in a very dynamic situation and every day matters.
Thank you, Stefano Vaccara, Voce di New York. This is a follow-up and another question. So can we say that you, after the meeting in Washington, you are satisfied, completely satisfied? Because there were reactions in Washington by the other party that say that President Biden was too weak in his reaction toward Russia. So I would like you to respond to this. And then today, what you heard so far, the speeches, there will be more, China will speak. Are you satisfied, the reaction? Is Russia isolated enough in this building at the moment?
I will be satisfied when the last Russian soldier withdraws from Ukrainian territory. Until it doesn't happen, I cannot be fully satisfied. But what we saw yesterday and the day before in Washington, in London, in Brussels, in Ottawa, was a clear demonstration that, that our partners understand clearly one simple fact. This is not only an attack on Ukraine. This is an attack on the existing world order. And the fact that they imposed the first wave of sanctions is appreciated. The decision of the German government to hold Nord Stream 2 is appreciated, but this is not enough to stop Putin. And this is why the message that I received yesterday in Washington, that what was already done is not the end of story, and more actions will be taken. And we will be looking forward to it. And my message is simple, that do not wait too long. You have to act now. Literally every day, decisions have to be adopted. More sanctions have to be imposed. More weapons have to be supplied. More diplomatic efforts have to be undertaken.
Mr. Minister, I would like to come back to UN topic actually, because since we're here. You already mentioned about the tools, practical tools that can be implemented by UN to help Ukraine. Can you be more specific about deadlines, about conditions when we can talk about, like, for example, strengths of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, or like peacekeeping missions that actually everybody is expected to see? Thank you. Again, deadline for every action aimed at preventing the war is now. We all have our bureaucracies, national governments, international organizations. They are essentially bureaucratic structures, and we understand that there are procedures. So the sooner these procedures are launched, the better it is. The situation deteriorates every day, and no one can allow waiting until it's too late.
Because they all spoke in such a positive way about NATO. We thought like we were NATO and they were also NATO, but they had ownership and agency and just possession of the NATO possibilities. The representative of Russia who was there was Boris Yeltsin, and he was very ebullient as he was. Many of you are too young to remember how ebullient he was, but he was welcoming to what was called, it was the expansion. We had supported in our own country, the Baltic states, Poland, other countries becoming part. It was called the Partnership for Peace, and it included many of the countries. And now Putin is saying, push it back pre-1997. Don't ever try to add another country, and remove the weapons out of Eastern Europe. That's what he wanted. No, that was not going to happen. So as Barbara, as all of our colleagues have mentioned, diplomacy, diplomacy, diplomacy. Diplomacy deterrence, diplomacy to stop what is going on should he see the light at some point. Diplomacy is always first and foremost our path to peace. Any questions on this subject? Yes, ma'am.
Do you think the president's sanctions went far enough? Because at the outset there were some, even his closest allies, that felt that he could have issued harsher sanctions. Senator Chris Coons comes to mind. And then following up on that, there is a group of lawmakers from both sides of the aisle that are calling on the president to respect Congress's war authorities. Do you support that as well?
I certainly support that, but I don't think those two things are related. The fact is the President of the United States, by executive order, has the power to exercise impose the sanctions. We understand this. We are not in this alone. The beauty of it all is that it is a unified effort of our NATO allies, of which, and of course, U.S. and Canada from this side of the Atlantic and on the others. The steps that the President is taking are appropriate. The Europeans feel the pain more than we do of sanctions. It is not without any collateral impact in their countries. When you do what we heard from the, shall we say, the head of the EU, the president of the EU Commission, was that they're into diversification in terms of their energy, meeting their energy needs and the rest, so they're not as dependent. But it will have an impact in the beginning. I think the president has full knowledge of what impact these sanctions will have, and is fully ready to go all the way with it. And that's something that we have done together. I'm going to have Barbara Lee speak about the authorization of the use of military force, because this is something she's been a champion on for her entire service in the Congress. That's a different subject than as to whether the president can impose sanctions as to whether we can go to war. Barbara?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, I did sign the letter that Congressman Peter DeFazio
excuse. Everyone perfectly understands what is happening here. And the attack on the Secretary General by the Russian ambassador is unprecedented. And if the United Nations tolerate such an attack, it will be only the United Nations who will suffer the most and who will end up discredited and unrespected.
Thank you. Mr. Foreign Minister, and thank you for this availability, and welcome to New York. There has been a lot of concern about how President Biden described the invasion by Russia, calling it the start of an invasion. Just to follow up to what you mentioned, did you talk to him about how he might have moved the goalpost in imposing sanctions on Russia, how for months he threatened to impose those hard-hitting sanctions, and now there is talk that perhaps throwing Russia out of the SWIFT financial system might be out of the question. That was the nuclear option. And my second question is, after what you heard from the Russians today at the United Nations General Assembly, under what circumstance would you sit down at the same table with your Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, for some kind of negotiation about this matter? Thank you.
As far as I understand President Biden, his idea is to impose sanctions by waves. And we accept this approach. But what I said to the President yesterday, what I said to other interlocutors and during my meetings here in the United Nations, is that these waves should come one after another. Again, we appreciate decisions already taken, but they're not enough to prevent Russia from changing their mind, to prevent President Putin from changing their mind. This is not enough. And we should not allow Russia the slightest possibility to think that the unbearable sanctions which were promised to them will be bearable. Now, on Minister Lavrov, I was appointed as foreign minister in March 2020, and since then there were numerous attempts to arrange our meeting in Normandy formats. I reach out to speak bilaterally on the phone to him, but he never picks up the phone. He never agrees he never agreed to meet in the Normandy format. He is talented enough to find all kinds of excuses why he shouldn't show up. So I don't care about him. If he is ready to convince President Putin to stop this madness, we are ready to sit down. I'm open. If he just follows if he just reinforces the narratives of President Putin and chooses war to diplomacy, that's his choice. That's his choice, and he will pay for that.
Hello, I'm Kaori Yoshida from Nikkei, Japanese business news. Japan, along with some Western nations, have imposed sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. There are a lot of Japanese media here today. Could we get a reaction from you on these movements and for the announcement of potential additional sanctions by Japan?
We expect a stronger reaction by Japan and a stronger action by Japan for a number of reasons which I'm not going to elaborate on today. I believe Japan must be vitally interested in not allowing Russia to crush the existing world order based on rules, and not to demonstrate by its example to others that this is a path of success, and the one who dares eventually succeeds. And these are the global consequences of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Because if we are not able to defend very simple fundamental principles in Europe, it means that we are not able to defend them in any other part of the world. So a stronger reaction by Japan is most welcome. And I understand that some countries may think this is not our fight. We have to wait and see how it ends up. Some believe that we have excellent relations with Russia. Why should we put them at stake? But this is not about Ukraine. This is really about the destruction of the world order. And every nation who has this kind of considerations should understand simple fact. Now Russia tries to behave nicely to them, to keep them under control and avoid additional pressure coming from new corners. But if Russia succeeds, the next step for Russia will be to build their relations with those countries from a dominant position, because they will demonstrate that this is what we are capable to do, and this is where we are capable, we can be successful. So every country should be mindful of that consequence. Russia may smile to you today, like they did with Minsk agreements. For 7 years they were convincing everyone that Minsk agreements is the only and fundamental basis for diplomatic solution. They were saying on every corner that Minsk agreements were endorsed by the UN Security Council resolution. This is a sacred document that everyone has to focus on. But one morning they changed their plan and they abandoned everything. It's crazy. A permanent member of the United Nations Security Council killed the document endorsed by the United Nations Security Council resolution, which they supported and had been convincing everyone to follow it. So the mood, the attitude can change in a day, and every country should understand that. Every country should understand that making compromises comes at a price to all. Thank you. Have a good day. Stay safe.
People in trouble in Russia because they showed the arrogance and the wealth with which he lived. So it's about, what is this about? The people of Hungary, and many of us have visited Ukraine and have seen that they love democracy. They do not want to live under Vladimir Putin. He does not want the Russian people to see what democracy looks like, and therefore he wants to bring them under his domain and his domain. So when he and his oligarchs, and it's all about, follow the money in this, and that's what the sanctions are about. Follow the money. When they see how they're going to be undermined, how these visas will work, about how they can travel and have residences in every opulent place in the world. The Russian people have to see how they have been exploited by their own government. When I was in the panel with the defense minister, another woman from Germany, she was talking about, in the context of what Barbara Lee talked about misinformation and the rest, people have to know the truth. They have to know the truth. And part of what Putin is the master of, KGB, 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 for his life, his orientation, is misrepresentation. And he's effective at that unless we inoculate against it, unless we make the case against it so that the Russian people know the truth, that the surrounding areas know the truth. So it is, when we talk about the president, he's doing the sanctions. He has a full picture of all this. I said he was present there the day of the expansion of NATO. I saw the respect he commanded then, and that was 1997, by the heads of state of all of those countries. And of course, that has only grown over time by his leadership, but also the expansion of NATO. I think we're very well served. Respect his judgment. And again, it's not just about when you do the sanctions or how you support the people. It's about how the world views what Putin is doing. This is a very evil move on the part of Vladimir Putin. He's a KGB guy who happens to be probably the richest man in the world because of his exploitation of his own people that he doesn't want them to know about, and uses excuses like, it's changed. Every time you hear him say, well, they're part of us, that's who we are, they should be us. Now they're saying, well, we have to go in because they want to be part of NATO. This, my friends, is our moment. This is the Sudetenland. That's what people were saying there. You cannot ignore what Putin is doing. And nobody's, of course, ignoring it, but you cannot take it any lighter than what it is, a total assault on democracy. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
On the State of the Union, you've had pretty unique security challenges through the last couple of State of the Unions. We did insurrection, COVID. This year there's talk of these trucker protests. Are you confident in the security of the Capitol ahead of the State of the Union this year?
Well, again, this is in the realm of the police. Of my understanding, when we arrived here last night, that the chief of police had called for the National Guard to be present leading up to and around the time of the State of the Union, that they have a good handle on what the expectation is. Some of it won't even come until after the State of the Union, but no, I feel confident. Now, I don't have, people said, oh, don't let them put up a fence. That's not my call. That's a security call, and that's the call of the sergeants at arms and the chief of police. Thank you all very much. Thank you. You don't have any closing statements? No.
during the Suez Crisis in 1956. And again, when we said there was no legal basis for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. These were not easy decisions. They were not necessarily popular in all quarters, or even among some of our allies. But they were based on a powerful belief in law, in rules, in common decency, and in multilateralism that is now embedded in our bones. We need to remember that invasion and war bring with them terrible losses and terrible hardships. There is no cause for celebration and triumph in these wars. There's only the squalor, the poverty, and the heartache of irreparable loss. There's been much talk about legacies. Let's be clear. That will be the only legacy of those who are responsible for this entirely avoidable conflict. All those countries formerly under the yoke of tyranny, communism, empire, they share this right with Ukraine. Canada's history and our proud association with all the people of Eastern Europe have led us to this point. We are partners in peace. We are partners in the quest for security and prosperity, and partners in the struggle for a world bound together by peaceful, friendly relations among nations and a common commitment to democracy and the rule of law. Mr. President, in closing, I would say this. In the darkest days of World War II, it is said that a representative of the United States government, Harry Hopkins, was having a meeting with Winston Churchill. And at the end of that meeting, he said, "Whither thou goest, I will go. Whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people." And so Canada says to Ukraine and to all those who are challenged, whither thou goest, we will go. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada for your statement. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Poland.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, we are gathered in this chamber because we, the peoples of the United Nations, all and each of us, have pledged to the UN Charter to, I quote, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human persons, in the equal rights of the men and women, and all nations, large and small. And as Secretary General rightly said, UN Charter is not a la carte menu. We are gathered in this chamber today to preserve these ideals and to protect the positive developments in the world's history that occurred during the 77 years of our organization has existed. Nobody should be allowed to reverse the course of the history and to question our common achievements. There is no return to the world from before the United Nations, the world of imperialism, colonialism, and the superiority of one country over another. And yet today, sadly enough, we are witness of such actions against Ukraine, with Russia openly questioning the right of a statehood of a fellow member state. Russian recent actions have further compounded the deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation in non-government controlled territories of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Reported widespread cases of arbitrary detentions, torture and ill treatment of detainees, as well as a violation of human freedoms, fundamental rights, and these areas are extremely worrying. It seems like we have been driven to the very brink of a major security crisis whose scale might be unprecedented of proportion. In this situation, we cannot and we will not remain silent. Poland calls today for every member state of this respected organization to clearly reiterate the commitment to operate within the letter and the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations. Article 2 of the document stipulates clearly, and I quote again, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat of or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, end of quote. There is no place for indifference here. We call all in each member state to strongly condemn all acts of aggression and continuing policies of fait accompli pursued by Russia. This aggression must stop, and Russian forces must be withdrawn. We must assertively deplore such manifestations of neo-imperialism and possessiveness. Having learned from our history, Poland stands with those who choose freedom over bondage, the rules of international law over brutal force, and peace over conflict. Therefore, we shall continue to firmly stand by our neighbors, Ukraine and its people. We support Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We strongly believe in the right of every state to pursue its own foreign policy, including the freedom of choice of alliances and partnership. Distinguished delegates, the world would be better, a safer place, if all countries respected the fundamental rights of fellow member states. Today, we cry out, stop denying them to Ukraine, and stop denying them in so many other troubled places around the world. Despite recent setbacks, Poland believes in diplomacy as a mediation being the only path of peaceful resolution of conflicts. Therefore, as the current chairmanship in office of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, we have proposed to launch a new initiative called Renewed European Security Dialogue. We offer our good services to make it a success. Distinguished delegates, Mr. President, history has not ended. Let's move it forward together. Let's not allow any old resentments or past frustrations to hold you back. Большое спасибо. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Poland. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Croatia.
Mr. President, Croatia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union, and I will make a few additional remarks in my national capacity. Croatia reaffirms unwavering support to the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. In this spirit, we echo Secretary General's statement on Ukraine on Monday and yesterday. We reject Russia's decision to recognize the self-proclaimed regions of Donetsk and Luhansk as an act in clear violation of international law, from the UN Charter to the Minsk agreements. This regrettable step is gravely undermining efforts for a diplomatic solution to the crisis. We reiterate Croatia's consistent and principled position of non-recognition of the illegal annexation of Ukraine's autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. We also continue to be worried about the militarization of the Crimean Peninsula, as well as by further attempts to restrict freedom of navigation through the Kerch Strait, including to and from the Sea of Azov. Croatia consistently supports a peaceful resolution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine by diplomatic means. We reiterate our full support for the efforts of the Normandy format, the Trilateral Contact Group, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. as well as the other diplomatic initiatives and missions. Now is the time to engage constructively towards a sustainable and peaceful solution, with a view to the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. We also remain deeply concerned with reports of serious violations and continuous deterioration of human rights and humanitarian situation in eastern Ukraine, as well as in Crimea. We continue to support critical protection, monitoring, reporting, and advocacy work of the UN High Representative for Human Rights and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. We are concerned with numerous ceasefire violations and support the work of OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, and in current circumstances, particularly ask Russia to ensure the personal safety of the monitors and to allow unhindered implementation of their duties under the agreed mandate. After 8 years of conflict, the deteriorating security situation in eastern Ukraine has dire consequences for all Ukrainians, especially millions of civilians living in and near the conflict zone. Distinguished delegates, we need no further threatening escalation. What is required is immediate return to dialogue based on international law, in particular the UN Charter and the Minsk agreements. The relevant General Assembly resolution on Ukraine, as well as the recommendation contained in the reports of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Croatia. And I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union, and I would like to make some additional remarks in my national capacity. Mr. President, we meet at a time when, as the Secretary General said, the UN and the international system are being tested. The decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the so-called independence of and send troops to the separatist-controlled territories in Ukraine is a violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. It is also a violation of the UN Charter and of the Minsk agreements endorsed by the Security Council. We can only see these actions by Russia as a deliberate choice to further escalate an already volatile situation. The Netherlands strongly condemns these acts and has responded firmly in close coordination with our partners. Any further escalation will be met with a similarly firm response. We call on Russia to reverse its illegal decisions, to immediately withdraw its troops, and to engage seriously and in good faith in dialogue with Ukraine to find a diplomatic solution. Mr. President, unfortunately, this is not a new situation. Russian violation of international law in Ukraine already started 8 years ago. The illegal annexation of Crimea and the ongoing destabilizing role of Russia in Donbass go directly against Article 2, as just quoted by the Permanent Representative of Canada. Like many others, I therefore reiterate my country's strong commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its international recognized borders, so including Crimea and its adjacent waters. Mr. President, the events of the past 8 years have already come at considerable cost for the affected population. As the Secretary General said, in a situation of conflict, it is the citizens that suffer first and suffer most. We therefore thank the Secretary General and all UN agencies for their continuous support to the people through its humanitarian operations and human rights efforts. We also thank the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission for the indispensable work of their monitors. As the OHCHR reports clearly show, the human rights situation on the illegally occupied Crimean Peninsula and in the non-government controlled areas in eastern Ukraine remains deeply concerning. Residents of the peninsula face systematic restrictions of fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of expression, religion or belief and association, and the right to peaceful assembly. The Kingdom of the Netherlands urgently calls on Russia to respect the human rights on the Crimean Peninsula and to allow full access for human rights monitors. Mr. President, when talking about the occupied territories in Ukraine, I cannot but touch upon Flight MH17 that was shot down over the east of Ukraine on the 17th of July 2014. This terrible tragedy caused the death of 298 innocent civilians from 17 different countries, including 196 of my own compatriots. Since that day, the Netherlands has, together with many international partners, called for truth, justice and accountability. This is what the victims and their next of kin deserve. The start in March 2020 of the criminal trial has been a very important step towards finding the truth, establishing justice, and holding those responsible to account. At the same time, the criminal investigation continues, and we call upon all countries, including Russia, to fully cooperate with this investigation in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2166. Let me end by reiterating that sustainable peace and stability in the region will only be possible if the Russian Federation moves away from the current path of escalation by fully respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and returning to the path of dialogue and negotiations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Netherlands. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, chers collègues, par la Charte des Nations Unies, nous, États membres, nous sommes engagés à pratiquer la tolérance, à vivre en paix l'un avec l'autre dans un esprit de bon voisinage et à unir nos forces pour maintenir la paix et la sécurité internationale. Nous nous retrouvons aujourd'hui, beaucoup l'ont déjà dit, à la croisée des chemins. Ou pour reprendre les mots du secrétaire général, les principes de la Charte ne constituent pas un menu à la carte. Nous devons tous les appliquer, à tout moment et dans leur ensemble. La reconnaissance par la Fédération de Russie des régions ukrainiennes de Donetsk et Luhansk dans leurs frontières administratives comme États indépendants constitue une violation de l'intégrité territoriale et de la souveraineté de l'Ukraine et donc une violation manifeste du droit international, en particulier de la Charte des Nations Unies. La Suisse condamne ces violations par la Russie. En reconnaissant l'indépendance de ces régions, la Russie a aussi violé les accords de Minsk qu'elle a co-signés. Ces accords servent de base à la désescalade et à la résolution politique pacifique du conflit dans l'est de l'Ukraine. En tant que membre du groupe de contact trilatéral, la Russie a l'obligation de soutenir la mise en œuvre des accords de Minsk. Elle s'est également engagée à les mettre en œuvre par le biais de la résolution 2202 du Conseil de sécurité. La Suisse est fortement préoccupée par l'envoi de troupes russes dans l'est de l'Ukraine et par le risque élevé d'une escalade militaire. Elle appelle la Russie à respecter ses obligations internationales et à revenir sur ses actes, ainsi qu'à retirer ses troupes et à contribuer à la désescalade. La Suisse réitère son plein soutien à l'indépendance, à la souveraineté et à l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine à l'intérieur de ses frontières internationalement reconnues. Mon pays appelle tous les acteurs à respecter le droit international, notamment le droit international humanitaire et les droits de l'homme. La population civile lourdement éprouvée, les personnes hors de combat et les infrastructures civiles doivent être protégées. Les besoins humanitaires sont élevés. Face à cette crise, la Suisse souligne le rôle essentiel de l'Organisation pour la sécurité et la coopération en Europe et de sa mission spéciale d'observation. Cette mission civile et non armée doit pouvoir remplir son mandat sans interférence et avoir un accès sûr et sécurisé à toute l'Ukraine. Mon pays continue de soutenir la mission et notre personnel y restera engagé. Nous en appelons à la poursuite d'une résolution diplomatique et politique du conflit et saluons l'offre de bons offices du secrétaire général des Nations Unies. Monsieur le Président, cela fait 8 ans que cette Assemblée se réunit chaque année en réaffirmant son soutien à l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine, suite à l'annexion de la République autonome de Crimée et de la ville de Sevastopol par la Fédération de Russie. Tous les ans, mon pays, comme beaucoup d'autres, réitère sa condamnation de l'annexion comme un acte contrevenant au droit international. Depuis 8 ans, la population civile affectée par le conflit voit son espoir légitime pour un avenir plus sûr et plus pacifique déçu. Il est grand temps que cela change. La violence engendre la violence. Elle n'est jamais une solution. Les conflits doivent être résolus par des moyens diplomatiques. Le chemin du dialogue doit toujours rester ouvert. La Suisse reste à disposition pour soutenir tous les efforts dans ce sens. Je vous remercie.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Zong方对乌克兰局势的演变表示关注。中国关于维护各国主权和领土完整的立场是一贯的。联合国宪章的宗旨和原则也应当得到共同维护。同时，我们注意到，乌克兰问题有着复杂的历史经纬和现实因素，演变至今是一系列因素共同作用的结果。当前形势下，有关各方都要保持克制，避免任何可能加剧紧张局势的行动。中方呼吁各方认识到落实安全不可分割原则的重要性，继续开展对话协商，在平等和相互尊重的基础上，继续通过和平方式寻求解决彼此关切的合理方案。我们欢迎并鼓励一切致力于推动外交解决的努力。谢谢你，主席先生。
I thank the distinguished representative of China. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Mr. President, colleagues, today's annual UN General Assembly debate on Ukraine takes place at a critical time for Ukraine, for Europe, and for our international community. Consistent with the UN Charter and as members of the General Assembly, it is our responsibility to do all that we can do to avoid the deadly consequences of war. We know only too well that the cost of conflict falls on civilians, with a disproportionate burden carried by women, children, and the elderly. Death, injury, displacement, loss of critical infrastructure, reduced access to healthcare and education, and the curtailment of human rights and freedoms. This is why New Zealand stands so strongly opposed to Russia's deliberate and provocative actions taken in the last few days. Russia's actions represent a clear breach of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and a sharp violation of international law and the Minsk agreements. New Zealand strongly supports the sovereign right of any state to determine its own future, including in terms of its security relationships. We have been consistent in expressing our strong support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty and international diplomatic efforts to find a peaceful solution. There is no basis under international law for the recognition of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Their recognition by Russia and the deployment of Russian troops into the Donetsk and Luhansk regions undermines diplomatic efforts towards a de-escalation of the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. New Zealand is deeply concerned that this is a calculated act by Russia to create a pretext for an invasion of Ukraine. Everyone in this chamber knows that a military invasion is an act of aggression and a violation of one of the most fundamental principles of international law. We join the Secretary-General in being deeply concerned about the perversion of the concept of peacekeeping. We agree that when troops of one country enter the territory of another country without its consent, they are not peacekeepers at all. Recent increases in ceasefire violations and civilian casualties in the conflict zones in the Donbas region are of great concern. Human rights violations in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics and in Russian-occupied Crimea are very troubling. New Zealand joins the international community in calling for human rights violations in the Donbas region to cease. We encourage Russia, Ukraine, and other parties to intensify dialogue, including through a return to the Normandy format, with a focus on bringing an urgent de-escalation of tension. We call on Russia and all parties to respect international humanitarian law. And we call on Russia to commit to dialogue to resolve its security concerns, to act in the interests of peace and the principles of the United Nations, and to act consistently with its responsibilities as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Russia's continued efforts to undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine represent one of the most significant risks to international peace and security for decades. The impacts of such a conflict will not be confined to Europe. It will further destabilize the international community at a time when geostrategic uncertainty is already high. The international rules system is under pressure, and the global economy remains fragile, all compounded by the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a dangerous time. We are at a critical juncture, but it is one where we believe that diplomacy must prevail in preventing a conflict that would have tragic consequences for Ukraine, for Europe, for Russia, and for the world. New Zealand supports the Secretary-General's rallying call to resolve this crisis without further bloodshed. We stand ready to support international diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the crisis in Ukraine in any way we can. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Mr. President, Italy aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and wishes to add the following remarks of its own. We strongly condemn the decision by the Russian Federation to recognize the independence of the self-proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Lugansk and to deploy Russian forces in the Donbas region. These acts are unacceptable violations of Ukraine's democratic sovereignty and territorial integrity, are inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and contradict the Minsk agreements endorsed by the Security Council and of which the Russian Federation is a signatory party. The EU has already responded to these violations with additional restrictive measures, including on economic relations and trade with the non-governmental controlled areas, in the financial sphere with asset freeze of some banks and restrictions on sovereign debt, as well as against individuals and entities responsible for undermining the territorial integrity of Ukraine. In line with UN General Assembly Resolution 68/262, Italy also reaffirms its non-recognition of the illegal annexation of the Crimea Peninsula and reiterates its unwavering support and commitment to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. This position has been stated by Italy also in its capacity as the current presidency of the Council of Europe. We call on Russia to reconsider its decisions to de-escalate tensions, to withdraw military forces from Ukraine's territory, and to fully abide by its international commitments. As the Secretary General, whose efforts we appreciate, pointed out yesterday and today, we need de-escalation now, and now is the time to return to negotiations. We urge Russia to pursue dialogue on security issues through the US-Russia Strategic Stability Dialogue, the NATO-Russia Council, and the OSCE. We commend the renewed OSCE European Security Dialogue launched by the Polish OSCE chairmanship in office, and we encourage Russia to engage constructively in it. While the offer of dialogue remains standing, any further military initiative against Ukraine would trigger an additional united and firm response. Mr. President, after almost 8 years of conflict and in light of the latest developments, we are more and more concerned about the condition of the civilian population in Ukraine, which continues to bear the heaviest burden. It is of the utmost importance to provide effective and unhindered assistance to those in need and to help preserve the economic and financial stability of Ukraine, which is being further undermined by the current crisis environment. In this regard, Italy intends to support Ukraine with an amount of around 110 million euros in aid credit and grants. Building on the support that it has provided since 2014, Italy remains committed to do its part together with its European partners and in full solidarity with the Ukrainian people. Mr. President, Italy will continue to be actively engaged in close coordination with its European partners and with its allies to promote a peaceful solution to this crisis and to avert a conflict at the heart of Europe, which would have disastrous humanitarian and economic consequences. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Italy. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this morning. We shall hear the remaining speakers at 3 p.m. today in this hall. The meeting is adjourned.